The evening in Berlin was calm, the city lights glowing against the dark sky as people filled the streets with laughter, footsteps, and the sound of cars rushing past. Inside one of the finest restaurants in the city, the atmosphere was warm and filled with the quiet clinking of glasses, the aroma of fresh bread, and the hum of soft music. Guests came here not just to eat but to experience elegance. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved gracefully between the tables, making sure every detail was perfect. At the far end of the restaurant, a group of men entered together, and the room seemed to shift. They carried an air of importance that made others turn their heads. Leading them was a man who was known not only in Berlin but across the world. He was a billionaire, wealthy beyond imagination, the kind of man who had been written about in magazines and shown on television. His life was often painted as glamorous, and his confidence seemed to confirm every rumor of his success. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a sense of superiority that filled the room. Behind him were his companions, friends, and business partners, who looked at him with admiration, laughing at his jokes even before they were fully spoken. They sat at a large table, and the staff immediately hurried to serve them, aware of who they were. At this table, power and money seemed to be seated side by side, and the billionaire enjoyed the attention. For him, dining out was not just about food, it was about being seen, being admired, and showing that he was above the ordinary world. At this moment, the waitress assigned to the table walked over. She was a young black woman, wearing the restaurant's uniform of a neatly pressed white shirt and black apron. Her hair was pulled back, and her eyes showed focus and calm. She greeted them politely, her tone professional and her posture confident. To her, this was another evening at work, another group of guests to be served with care. She had no idea that tonight her patience would be tested in a way that would be remembered by everyone in the room. She held her notepad ready, prepared to take their orders, as she had done countless times before. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, giving her a long look. His lips curved into a smirk, and his eyes shifted to his companions as if he had discovered some private joke. To him, she was not just a waitress, she was an opportunity to entertain his friends. Without thinking of the weight of his words, he turned to them and, in German, made a remark about her appearance. His words carried a sharp edge, wrapped in humor, meant to belittle her. His companions chuckled, nodding as if the remark had been clever. The billionaire, encouraged by their reaction, continued. He spoke about how amusing it was to see someone like her working in such a sophisticated place, as if she did not belong there. Every word he spoke was meant to be hidden behind the language barrier, a cruel play made safe because he assumed she could not understand. The waitress heard the laughter and saw the way their eyes glanced at her. She did not flinch. Her training had taught her to keep calm, to let nothing disturb her composure in front of customers. She wrote down their orders with steady hands, pretending not to notice. Yet inside, she felt the sting. She understood every word, though he did not know it. She had learned German fluently during her years of study, but she did not show this knowledge now. Instead, she allowed the billionaire to continue, her silence a mask that hid her strength. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the quiet awareness that the man across from her was showing more about himself than about her. His arrogance filled the table like smoke, but she knew smoke always fades. Other diners in the restaurant began to notice the group. The billionaire's voice was loud, his laughter carried, and his companions encouraged him. Some guests glanced over, their brows furrowed slightly as if sensing that something was not right. But no one spoke up. In places like this, wealth often created an invisible shield, and most preferred to avoid confrontation. The waitress, however, was not powerless, though she let the moment unfold without interruption. She served their drinks, placing each glass gently on the table, and continued with her duties. Her eyes remained calm, her lips pressed in a polite smile, but inside her mind she was waiting. The billionaire, unaware of the storm he was about to face, leaned closer to his friends and spoke again in German, this time more boldly. He mocked the way she walked, compared her to stereotypes that were both cruel and unfounded, and ended with a laugh that made the table roar. To him, this was entertainment. To her, it was a test. She stood quietly, her notepad in hand, her gaze steady. She had faced challenges far greater than this before. Life had taught her resilience. She remembered the years of studying late at night, the sacrifices she made to reach this city, and the many times people had underestimated her only for her to rise above. She knew she did not need to prove herself to him, but she also knew silence sometimes allowed arrogance to grow unchecked. In those minutes, the billionaire believed he was in full control. His words, his wealth, and his companions gave him confidence. Yet control is fragile when it rests on false assumptions. The waitress took a slow breath as she realized she held a truth that could shift the entire room. She knew his game, but he did not know hers. To him, she was invisible beyond her role. To her, he was revealing his true character, one word at a time, and she stored each remark like a stone, preparing for the moment she would decide to use them. The restaurant continued to hum with life, but at their table, the atmosphere carried an edge. The billionaire smiled broadly, enjoying the sound of his own voice, unaware that every person has a limit, even the quiet ones. The waitress's silence was not weakness. It was strength, waiting for the right second to show itself. And when it did, it would turn his laughter into silence. For now, though, she let the stage build. The first act of the evening was complete, though none of his friends could see the story already forming around them. The waitress walked away from the table after taking the orders, her steps calm and steady even though her heart was still heavy from the laughter behind her. She carried the tray of glasses toward the bar, setting them down with practiced care. From the outside, she looked composed, her face showing no sign of the insult she had just endured. But inside, her thoughts were moving quickly. She knew exactly what had been said, every word of the mockery, every careless laugh that had followed. And yet, she chose not to respond immediately. She had learned long ago that timing mattered more than quick reactions. There was a strength in silence when it was used wisely. As she prepared their drinks, she reminded herself why she was there. This job was not her dream, but it was a step along her journey. She had come to Berlin to build a better life, carrying with her not only the weight of her family's hopes but also her own determination to succeed. She had studied in universities where the classrooms were filled with students from different corners of the world. She had written papers in German, debated in German, even joked in German with her friends. Fluency in the language was no struggle for her. But when she wore the uniform of a waitress, people often saw only what they wanted to see. And tonight, this billionaire saw only what his pride allowed him to see, a target for his arrogance. She remembered her grandmother's words from years ago, "Child, never let anyone's opinion shrink your worth. Silence can be louder than noise, if you choose the right moment." Those words stayed with her now as she polished the glasses and returned to the table with elegance. The billionaire and his companions were still laughing, their voices echoing across the dining room, louder than the soft music in the background. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, speaking again in German, this time pointing out the way she carried the tray. "Look how serious she is," he said with a grin, "as if she's walking into a royal hall. Maybe she thinks she's part of our world." His friends burst into another wave of laughter, each trying to add their own jokes, each trying to win his approval. They laughed not because it was funny, but because it was expected. The waitress placed their drinks gently in front of them, her hands steady, her face calm. She looked at each man briefly, her eyes steady but unreadable, before stepping back. Inside, however, she was making her decision. She would not allow the evening to pass with only their laughter echoing. She would respond, but she would do so in a way they would never forget. Meanwhile, other diners began to sense the sharpness in the air. At nearby tables, couples glanced sideways, their eyes narrowing as they caught fragments of the conversation. Some did not understand German, but they understood tone. There was something cruel in the way the billionaire laughed, something that made the room feel colder. A waiter passing by exchanged a quick look with the waitress, as if asking silently if she was all right. She gave him a small nod, assuring him she could handle it. The billionaire ordered more drinks, speaking again in German, and this time his words were sharper. He spoke about people who worked in service jobs, saying they probably never went to university, never saw the inside of a library, and never traveled beyond their hometowns. "This is why they're here," he said, his tone half joking, half serious. "They serve, and we enjoy. That's the balance of the world." His companions nodded, some laughing, others smiling awkwardly, but none of them dared to challenge him. His wealth was like a shield, protecting him from truth, and they preferred to stay inside its shadow. The waitress listened, her chest tightening, but her mind clear. She knew that his words said more about him than about her. She remembered the long nights she spent studying, the scholarships she earned, the professors who praised her essays. She thought of the moments when she stood on stage giving presentations in perfect German, receiving applause from her peers. She thought of the places she had traveled, the people she had met, the languages she had mastered. If only he knew, she thought, how small his judgment looked compared to the reality of her life. But she did not want to answer with anger. Anger would only give him more to laugh at. She wanted her words to cut through the air like glass breaking, unexpected and undeniable. She wanted him to realize, without her raising her voice, that his arrogance had blinded him. As she returned to the kitchen, she felt a sense of calm settling inside her. She understood that dignity was not about ignoring insults, it was about knowing when and how to respond. She thought about the people watching, the quiet glances from other diners, the waiter who had worried for her. This was not only about her. This was about everyone who had ever been underestimated, mocked, or judged unfairly. She could not let the moment pass in silence. She would not allow his words to echo as truth. Back at the table, the billionaire raised his glass in a toast to his companions, still unaware of the storm building in the quiet waitress standing nearby. "To a world where we are always on top," he said in German, his voice loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. His companions raised their glasses too, repeating his words like an echo. The arrogance filled the air like smoke, thick and unpleasant, but still he laughed, enjoying his own reflection in their admiration. The waitress stood near the corner, her eyes on the table, her lips pressed in a faint smile. She had made her decision. The moment was coming. She would answer him, not with noise, not with anger, but with truth. She would use the very language he thought she could not understand. She would turn his stage into her own. The evening moved forward, but for her, time felt slow. She could hear the sound of the piano from the far end of the restaurant, the gentle notes filling the space like a reminder of patience. She could feel the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. She waited for the right moment, when his words would rise too high, when his laughter would be loudest, so her response would land with the weight of silence that followed. Every insult he had thrown at her became a stone she carried, but she carried them not as a burden, but as tools. She knew she was stronger than his arrogance, smarter than his assumptions, and more patient than his pride. Soon, he would know it too. And as she placed the next set of glasses before him, she looked him in the eye for the first time, her gaze steady and unshaken. He paused, surprised for a brief moment, then smirked again and made another remark in German, this one harsher than before. His friends laughed louder, leaning back in their chairs as if the show had reached its peak. The billionaire thought he had won the evening. What he did not know was that the real evening had not even begun. The restaurant was alive with quiet conversations, the glow of candles on polished tables, and the sound of glasses being raised in toasts. But at the billionaire's table, the air felt different. It was heavier, filled with arrogance and laughter that grew louder with every remark he made. His voice was like a drum that demanded attention, and his friends laughed along, trying to keep up with his rhythm. The billionaire believed the night belonged to him. He thought he had control over everyone at the table, over the waitress who stood silently, and even over the room itself. What he did not know was that his power was about to vanish in a way he had never experienced before. The waitress returned to the table carrying their food, the plates balanced carefully on her tray. She placed each dish in front of the men, her movements smooth and precise, her face calm as always. But her eyes, if one looked closely, carried something new. They were steady, firm, as though she had made a decision. She placed the last plate in front of the billionaire himself, bowing her head politely. He looked up at her with his usual smirk, ready to make another remark in German. "At least she can carry something without dropping it," he said loudly, making his companions chuckle again. That was the moment she chose. She straightened her back, looked directly at him, and for the first time since he arrived, she opened her mouth to speak. Her voice was calm but strong, smooth yet clear. And she spoke in perfect German. "Sir," she said, her words sharp enough to cut through the noise of the table, "I understood every word you have said since you arrived." The billionaire froze, the smirk slipping from his face. His companions blinked in shock, their laughter dying in their throats. The sound of her voice, fluent and confident, felt like a glass shattering on the floor. The restaurant seemed to pause, as if even the soft music had lowered its volume to listen. She continued, her voice never rising, her tone always respectful but unshakable. "You mocked my work. You mocked my place here. But what you do not know is that I speak your language, I know your culture, and I have studied in your universities. I carry more than this tray. I carry knowledge, dignity, and the ability to see through the mask of arrogance." The billionaire's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He had never expected this. He had thought she was invisible, someone who would never dare to respond, someone who would remain silent under his words. Now, she stood in front of him, fluent in his own language, exposing him in front of everyone. The men at his table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them looked down at his plate, ashamed. Another glanced around the restaurant, noticing that people were now watching. Diners at nearby tables had stopped their conversations, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. Some of them understood German and caught every word. Others didn't need to understand the language, they could feel the weight of the moment in her tone, in the stunned expression on the billionaire's face. The waitress did not tremble. Her hands were steady, her voice even. She spoke with the ease of someone who had spent years mastering the language, who had read books and written essays in it. Every word was placed carefully, not rushed, not shouted, just calmly laid down like undeniable truth. "I chose to remain silent until now," she said, still in German. "Not because I did not understand, but because silence can sometimes reveal more about a person than words. And you have revealed much tonight." A hush spread across the restaurant. It was the kind of silence that carried more power than applause. The billionaire sat there, frozen in his chair, his usual confidence shattered. His friends glanced at him, unsure whether to laugh or defend him, but none found the courage. For once, their leader had no control. The waitress then gave a small, professional smile, as though she had merely answered a polite question, and stepped back slightly. She did not continue. She did not need to. The air was thick with her words, and the silence that followed was her victory. The billionaire cleared his throat, his face turning red. He tried to speak, to make a joke, but the words caught in his throat. He reached for his glass, his hand trembling slightly, and took a long sip, hoping to cover his embarrassment. But nothing could hide what had just happened. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it. At another table, a man whispered to his companion, "She speaks better German than him." Someone else nodded, and a quiet ripple of admiration moved through the room. The staff at the restaurant, who had overheard the billionaire's earlier remarks but had remained silent out of fear of losing their jobs, now exchanged proud glances. The waitress had said what they never could. The billionaire's companions shifted in their seats, their earlier laughter now replaced with uneasy silence. The power of the evening had slipped out of their hands, and they knew it. They stared at their plates, trying to avoid eye contact, as if hoping the moment would vanish. But it did not. It hung in the air like a truth too heavy to ignore. The waitress turned and walked back toward the service station, her posture tall, her steps steady. She did not need to look back. She knew what she had done. She had turned his language into her weapon, his arrogance into his downfall. She had answered him not with anger, but with calm dignity that no one could laugh at. Back at the table, the billionaire sat in silence, his pride broken. He tried to force a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. He looked around the restaurant, realizing that every eye was on him. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. The pianist in the corner continued playing, the music soft and soothing, as though reminding the room that life moved on. But for everyone who had witnessed the moment, the memory would not fade. They had seen a quiet waitress stand against arrogance with nothing more than truth and confidence. And they had seen a billionaire, a man used to controlling every room he entered, lose control completely. The waitress returned to her duties, attending other tables with the same professionalism she always carried. She did not boast, she did not celebrate. She did not need to. Her actions had spoken louder than any cheer. To her, dignity was not about showing victory, it was about living it quietly. But to the billionaire, the moment echoed like thunder in his ears. He could not escape it. He had tried to mock her in German, believing it was his secret language, his private shield. And she had used that very shield to reveal his weakness. He had been exposed, not just in front of his friends, but in front of strangers who would surely tell the story again and again. The room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the air carried a new weight. The diners smiled quietly at the waitress as she passed by, some nodding to her in respect. She acknowledged them with a gentle smile but said nothing more. She did not need applause. The truth was enough. And at the billionaire's table, silence reigned. The billionaire sat stiffly in his chair, his hand still holding the glass of wine, though he had already finished it. His lips twitched as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. Around him, his companions shifted uneasily, their earlier laughter long gone. A few glanced at him with faint sympathy, while others avoided looking at him altogether, as if they were afraid that meeting his eyes would pull them into his humiliation. The room was filled with an odd silence, one that seemed to hum louder than the piano playing in the corner. People at nearby tables had turned back to their meals, but their minds were not on their food. They were replaying the moment in their heads, the moment when the waitress's calm words had turned the room upside down. Some whispered quietly to their companions, shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just unfolded. Others smiled faintly, their admiration for the waitress growing with every passing second. In a city like Berlin, where people often dined among strangers, this night had become something none of them would forget. The billionaire tried to laugh, forcing a grin. "Well, she's got spirit," he muttered, this time in English, as though that would make the sting of her German response fade away. But the words fell flat. No one at his table laughed. No one dared. His companions looked uncomfortable, each of them feeling the weight of his failed attempt to brush it all aside. The truth was too fresh, too raw, and no amount of joking could erase it. The waitress, meanwhile, moved gracefully across the dining room, attending to another table with the same professionalism she always carried. She smiled at an elderly couple, adjusted the candles on their table, and carefully set down their plates. She looked calm, almost serene, as if what had happened moments ago was just another part of her evening. But every guest who saw her now looked at her differently. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a figure of dignity and quiet power. Back at the billionaire's table, the silence was heavy. One of his friends finally spoke, his voice low. "Maybe we should, just enjoy the food." It was an attempt to move on, but the words sounded weak. Another friend nodded quickly, eager to agree, but no one lifted their fork. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his face red, his jaw clenched. For a man used to commanding boardrooms, giving speeches, and walking into places where people admired him instantly, this was unfamiliar territory. He was not used to losing control of the narrative. And tonight, in front of ordinary diners, he had lost it completely. The piano player in the corner began a new song, something light and elegant, but the music only made the contrast sharper. The room carried an unspoken awareness, the mighty had been humbled. Some diners gave each other knowing looks, as if silently agreeing that arrogance never wins in the end. Others sat straighter in their chairs, almost proud to have witnessed the moment. The billionaire, who had entered the restaurant as the loudest man in the room, now seemed the smallest. He reached for his phone, scrolling through it aimlessly, pretending to be busy, but his fingers shook slightly. His pride was wounded, and no amount of distraction could cover it. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, even from those who pretended not to stare. He hated it. He hated that the story had slipped out of his control, that a woman he had thought beneath him had turned the spotlight on him in a way he could not escape. The waitress approached again, this time with dessert menus. She laid them neatly on the table, her posture straight, her voice steady. "Would you like to see the options for dessert?" she asked in English, her tone polite but professional. Her eyes met his for a brief second. She did not need to say anything more. The look was enough. She had already spoken the truth, and she did not need to repeat it. The billionaire cleared his throat. "No, thank you," he said quickly, his voice quieter than before. His friends nodded, some almost too eagerly, as if agreeing with him would help ease the tension. The waitress gave a small nod, collected the menus, and walked away. From a corner of the room, a soft clap was heard. It was quick, almost hesitant, but it carried across the restaurant. Heads turned. A man at a nearby table smiled at the waitress as he brought his hands together again, clapping lightly. Soon, another diner joined, then another. Within moments, the restaurant filled with the sound of quiet applause. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was steady and meaningful. The billionaire's companions froze, their faces pale. The billionaire himself lowered his head, his jaw tight, his pride shrinking further with every clap. The waitress did not bask in the applause. She simply gave a small smile to the diners, bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement, and continued her work. To her, dignity was not about celebration. It was about standing tall even when others tried to pull you down. The applause was for her, but it was also a message to the billionaire: the room had chosen who they respected. The billionaire's face grew darker. He wanted to leave, to escape the eyes, the whispers, the unspoken judgment. But leaving too quickly would make it worse, as though he was running away. So he sat there, trapped in the very chair he had once thought was his throne. His companions tried to change the subject, speaking about business deals, about upcoming travel, but their voices carried no energy. The shadow of the moment hung over them like a curtain they could not lift. The waitress returned one last time with the check, placing it neatly on the table. "Whenever you are ready, sir," she said softly. Her voice was kind, but her words carried a quiet firmness. She was no longer invisible to him. She was the person who had turned his arrogance into shame. He reached for his wallet, pulling out several bills with shaking fingers. He placed them on the tray, more than enough to cover the meal. But it did not matter how much he paid. Money could not buy back the respect he had lost tonight. Money could not erase the silence that followed his mockery or the applause that honored the woman he had underestimated. The waitress took the tray, bowed politely, and walked away. She did not count the bills. She did not need to. Her victory was not in the tip but in the truth she had spoken. When the billionaire finally stood to leave, the room seemed to grow quieter. He straightened his jacket, lifted his chin slightly, and tried to walk with the same confidence he had entered with, But his steps were heavier now, his shoulders tighter. People watched, not with admiration, but with quiet judgment. Some smiled faintly, others shook their heads, but all of them knew what they had witnessed, the fall of arrogance before dignity. The billionaire stepped out into the cool night, his companions following silently behind him. The waitress watched from inside as the door closed behind them, the restaurant returning to its warm glow. She took a slow breath, her heart calm. She had not shouted, she had not lost her temper. She had simply spoken the truth, and the truth had been enough. That night, as the restaurant emptied and the staff began to clean the tables, several diners stopped to thank her. "You were amazing," one woman said quietly, placing a hand on her arm. Another man smiled and told her, "You reminded us all that respect matters more than wealth." She nodded, grateful but humble, never letting the attention change her. To her, it had not been about winning. It had been about standing up with dignity when it mattered most. When the billionaire and his companions left the restaurant, the door closed softly behind them, but the energy they left behind still lingered. Inside, the guests slowly returned to their meals, yet the moment was far from forgotten. It was as if everyone carried the same silent agreement that they had just witnessed something rare. They had seen arrogance crumble before quiet dignity, and it had left an impression deeper than any meal or any wine could offer. The music from the piano filled the room again, softer now, more meaningful, like a soundtrack to the evening's unspoken lesson. The waitress walked back to the counter, her steps measured and graceful. She began clearing dishes, arranging silverware, and returning to her duties. To her, the night was not about victory or applause. She did not crave recognition. All she wanted was to finish her work with the same calm pride she had carried from the start. Still, she could feel the weight of the glances around her. Diners smiled warmly as she passed their tables, some even whispering small words of encouragement. "Well done," one man said as he handed her his plate. "That was remarkable," another woman added. She responded with a polite smile, thanking them quietly before moving on. The staff, too, looked at her differently now. The other waiters and waitresses, who had watched in silence during the billionaire's mocking remarks, now felt a deep respect. One of them approached her near the service station and said softly, "You spoke for all of us tonight." She smiled and shook her head. "I just spoke for myself," she answered. But they knew it was more than that. She had stood for everyone who had ever been looked down on simply because of their job, their color, or their silence. Later that night, when her shift ended, she stepped outside into the cool Berlin air. The streets were quieter now, the sound of footsteps echoing against the pavement. She wrapped her scarf around her neck and walked slowly toward the bus stop. The city lights shimmered, reflecting on the wet ground from an earlier rain. She thought about the evening, replaying it in her mind. There was no anger left inside her, no bitterness. Instead, she felt a calm satisfaction, not because she had embarrassed a powerful man, but because she had shown him and everyone that dignity could not be mocked. Meanwhile, inside the billionaire's car, the mood was very different. He sat in silence, staring out the window as the city lights flashed past. His companions, who had once laughed at every word he spoke, now said nothing. They shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should comfort him or remain quiet. The billionaire clenched his jaw, his pride wounded more deeply than he could admit. For years, he had believed that money made him untouchable, that his status gave him the right to treat others however he pleased. But tonight, in front of strangers, he had been reminded that respect could not be bought, and arrogance could not shield him from truth. He would remember her words for a long time. The story did not stay inside the walls of the restaurant. The diners who had witnessed the moment carried it with them. Some retold it to their friends later that night over phone calls. Others spoke about it at breakfast the next morning, describing how a young waitress had silenced a billionaire with nothing but calm fluency and dignity. Soon, the story spread through whispers, then through social media. A guest who had been present posted a few lines about it online. Last night I saw a waitress stand up to a billionaire in perfect German after he mocked her. She left him speechless. The post was shared again and again, gathering thousands of reactions. People read it with admiration, inspired by the reminder that knowledge and respect hold more power than wealth and arrogance. The waitress did not know about the online discussions at first. To her, it had simply been one night, one encounter where she chose to speak when it mattered. But when a friend called her the next day and told her the story was circulating, she smiled faintly. She did not seek fame, and she did not want attention. But she was glad if her actions reminded people that silence is not weakness, and that everyone, no matter their job, carries worth and dignity. At the restaurant, the manager called her into the office. She worried briefly that she might be in trouble for speaking out, but instead, the manager smiled warmly. "You handled yourself with grace," he said. "I've already received calls from guests praising you. You represented not just yourself, but our entire restaurant." She thanked him, relieved, and returned to work with her head held high. Days turned into weeks, and the story continued to echo quietly in the city. People who had once walked past waiters and waitresses without a second glance now looked at them differently, reminded of the strength behind their uniforms. Some guests treated staff with more kindness, perhaps remembering the story they had heard. And for the billionaire, the memory lingered like a shadow he could not escape. He avoided returning to that restaurant, and his companions never spoke of the night again, though they all remembered. For him, it was a lesson written not in books or speeches, but in the quiet dignity of someone he had underestimated. The waitress continued her work as before, never boasting, never repeating the story herself. She lived her life with the same calm determination, her eyes always forward, her heart steady. She carried her grandmother's words in her heart: "Silence can be louder than noise, if you choose the right moment." And she had chosen her moment well. For those who had witnessed it, the night became a reminder they would never forget. It was not just about a billionaire and a waitress. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, and about the power of standing with dignity when others expect you to shrink. It was about the truth that respect is worth more than riches, and that words, when spoken at the right time, can change the balance of a room. Years later, some of those diners would still tell the story to their children, describing the night when arrogance was silenced by quiet strength. And though the billionaire's name might fade from their memory, the image of the young waitress standing tall would remain clear. For her, life moved forward as it always had. She studied more, pursued new opportunities, and built the life she had dreamed of. But deep inside, she carried the memory of that night as proof that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest weight. The billionaire had entered the restaurant that evening believing he was the strongest person in the room. He left humbled, reminded that respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. The waitress had entered the evening simply doing her job. She left as the person who had reminded everyone that dignity shines brightest when it is tested. And so the story lived on, not as a tale of wealth or fame, but as a testament to truth, that no matter how powerful someone may seem, a single voice spoken with calm courage can expose everything.